Hi guys, Grand J here and welcome to another one of our videos. So as a follow-up on our previous YouTube video where we talked about the upcoming European Championships and their two-deck format, I said that I'd create another video for you guys to talk about a little bit more about the depth of this two-deck format and about what sort of strategies players can use to improve their deck selection and a little other consideration in regards to tournament play. So for those of you guys who haven't really sort of heard from my previous video, the two-deck format is where both players, or all players in the tournament, bring two decks to the tournament. Each player will be playing in a best-of-3 for each round, and so each player will select either one of their two decks for the first game. Then in the second game, they will play their other deck, and then in the third game, if it is still a 1-1 result, then both players will select the deck that they lost with and play a third game with there. So this is a pretty interesting format, and it's a unique format for Final Fantasy TCG that we haven't seen before. So it is a bit of a hybrid from the normal format of just one deck best of 3 and the World Championship formats last year where each player had to bring in 3 decks. So this is an interesting new format and we haven't tested it at all. That being said though, this format is very similar to a format for a different card game, Hearthstone, and their Conquest format. So I do have a little bit of experience of what sort of strategies this could involve and how players can select their decks. So I'll go with 4 different strategies that you can use to determine what decks you want to bring to the tournament and how to best play them. So first of all, the most basic strategy is to select 2 decks that you're just really comfortable with. So obviously at the end of the day, it doesn't matter which deck you select, you're going to have to play them against really strong players, and you have to be among the best of the best in order to win the tournament and to qualify for the World Championships. So if you haven't determined which decks are best in the meta or what to play or which decks to choose with, just choose the 2 decks that you're most comfortable with and the ones that you've had the most local success. So these are decks that you generally are able to play the best, and these are decks that you're most comfortable with. Having 2 decks that you're playing very, very well is just a good strategy to go into any tournament. The second strategy that I'm going to suggest is playing 2 decks that can cover for each other's weaknesses. So if you have 2 different decks that have different strengths and different weaknesses, you can play 2 different decks that complement each other so that there's no opponent where you have any particular deck that you're facing against that you won't have an answer to. So for example, if you're playing a mono wind control deck, it can find itself a little bit weaker against more aggressive fast decks such as like an ice discard, turbo discard deck. So yeah, in that situation, you might choose to have your second deck or your other deck to be a Earth, Water, Earth, Wind type deck that has a much better, stronger matchup against a mono Earth discard, a mono Ice discard deck where you're going to be under a lot of pressure. So choosing 2 decks that can complement each other and knowing which opponents have what decks will allow you to choose a deck that's better suited against a specific opponent's deck selection and their playstyle. Thirdly, another interesting strategy that is a little bit counterintuitive is choosing a pair of decks that both hard counter a specific matchup. So while people are thinking, oh yeah, just select 2 decks that try to counter as many different matchups in the metagame, an interesting strategy that also worked within Hearthstone itself is to select 2 decks that do counter a specific matchup. Now, why would you select this? So if your meta call is pretty spot on, then this is actually really quite a strong strategy. So let's say if you are predicting that maybe 75 to 80% of the players in this tournament will be playing Mono Ice Discard, right? So it's quite a strong deck, and a lot of players have been playing it. So if you pick 2 particular decks that have strong matchups against it, such as playing an Earth deck and playing a Wind deck, both these decks have like very strong matchups against Ice decks. So if a large majority of the players in that tournament are playing that deck, you'll be able to win that game where you're playing against the Ice deck a large majority of the time, right? But you might follow on and ask, oh yeah, how do you win the other games, right? So if your opponent plays their secondary deck at some point during the match, yeah, even if you lose that, it's not too bad, because if you've beaten the Ice deck, they have to play the Ice deck again in the third game, and considering how both your decks are hard counters to Ice, or like one specific deck in the metagame, then you're going to win that third game as well. So choosing 2 decks that both hard counter a specific matchup can be a very viable strategy, but this is a strategy that's more viable if the metagame is very heavily favoring one specific deck that you think a large majority of the player base will be playing for that specific tournament. And finally, the fourth and sort of final strategy that you can use to select your deck is playing 2 decks with similar sort of strategies. This sort of has a very similar effect to the previous strategy that I talked about. If you have two decks with similar sort of strategies, whether they're both aggressive decks or whether they're both control decks or so on, if your opponent doesn't have specific tools to deal with that sort of deck, then they don't have the tools to deal with both of your decks, right? So if you play two control decks, if your opponent doesn't have tools or a deck that is able to deal with control decks, your opponent simply can't deal with both your decks, right? And if your opponent's playing like a control deck versus your control deck, if your opponent can't outscale your control decks, then you'll win that matchup. And if your opponent isn't able to beat both your decks, then you can just find yourself winning games or winning like matches overall because your opponent isn't specifically teched up against a very specific strategy. The two deck format does bring some interesting dynamics to it, and how you choose to go about selecting decks and what strategy you bring to your deck selection is very, very interesting and brings an extra level of preparation and sort of planning that you can bring to an event. That being said, though, there's also a couple of little quirks or little interesting steps that you can take during the tournament that change up because of this format as well. So, first of all, the first thing to consider is that no player is able to be a one trick. So, as in, no player can solely rely on one specific deck to carry them all the way through the entire tournament, right? So we all know those players who just like spend 90% of their time just playing one specific deck, right? These players, they generally are very experienced, and they found a deck that they're very, very good with, and it lines up very much with their personality and their playstyle, right? But these players, no matter how good they are with that first and primary deck, they have to learn a secondary deck. So if they haven't learned a secondary deck, they'll lose in this format, right? That being said, though, it means that if your two decks have a specific weakness, if that weakness is just one specific deck in the format, that's okay, because as long as you can have good matchups against the rest of the field, then you're fine. Even if you lose all your games against Turbo Ice Discard, if you have good matchups against everything else in the field, that's fine. It doesn't matter how many players you play against Turbo Ice. Even if you lose that matchup, if you're good against their other decks, then you're fine. So that is one consideration to take. That instead of trying to tech against all the matchups, for both your decks, select maybe one specific matchup that you're okay to be a little bit weaker against, and just tech up against everything else. Next thing to consider, and this is something that people very much have two different sides of this opinion on, but definitely I do think that if you're trying to play competitively and you're trying to maximize your chance of winning, it is something legitimate that you can do to increase your chances, and that is scouting, right? So we've all seen those guys at these larger tournaments, especially if they've got first round buys, they'll walk around the room and just see what all the other players are playing, what sort of decks they're playing. If they finish their round early, they'll go around, have a look, and just gather as much information to know, oh yeah, which specific players are playing what decks, and what decks are most common in the metagame, right? So that's, this is a very common occurrence in all large major tournaments. And this becomes even more relevant in a two-deck format, right? So if both players were playing in a single-deck format, there's really not much you can do before you sit down. So you both sit down, and in the first turn, you'll know what sort of deck your opponent is playing, right? You can't change your deck. There's nothing you could have done preemptively before the game to improve your odds, right? But if you scout around in the tournament, and you can figure out what two combination of decks a specific person is playing, then you can come into that matchup having a good feel for which two of your decks you want to play in your first game, right? So you can isolate specifically what weaknesses their two deck combination might have, and that gives you a better chance of selecting what your first deck is against them, right? Even more sort of like sneakiness, if you sort of want to go down this path, and it's completely legitimate, by the way. So even more sneakiness is, while you're going around the scouting and sort of memorizing what players are playing what, also, if you have the sort of extra mind capacity in your brain, memorizing what sleeves or what deck box they are holding each specific deck in is also very helpful. So if your opponent sits down and you can see that they pull out a specific deck or a specific deck box, even though they haven't revealed what deck it is or what's in their deck, if you've memorized the sleeve color or the deck box, then that gives you sort of like this preemptive knowledge of what deck they might be playing, and you can play your relevant hard counter, right? So this is one of those like things that's a little bit on the fringes on the rules, but there doesn't seem to be any sort of concrete rules against it just yet. So this is something you may consider doing if you want to take that competitive edge to the next level. And finally, one last thing is, whilst most of the time, in my perspective, I would play every game out until the last damage or until I've definitely lost, scooping or giving up on a game can be strategic in this format, simply because you have two different decks. When you, if you're losing in your first game, and it's a particular bad matchup, and you can tell kind of early on or in the mid game that you are going to lose the game, then giving up on that game is advantageous because it gives it hides certain deck information that you might want to save to another game or in your game 3, right? So if your first game you're losing, give up on it when you know you're pretty solidly beat. Play your second game, you potentially might win that, and then your third game, you're going into a situation where your second deck would have beaten their second deck, and hopefully you would have gotten a lot of information about their deck. And your first deck, your opponent hasn't seen too much because you sort of preemptively scooped up your cards. So your opponent is coming into the third game with a lot less knowledge than you have on their deck, right? Plus, you just played their deck. In the second game, so you come into your third game much more fresh and aware of what their deck is able to do, simply because you played them most recently in the second game. So these are just some interesting considerations and deck strategies that I have for a tournament like this. Definitely, I don't employ all these strategies all the time, but these are things that sort of high-level players can do, and they sort of don't talk about these sort of things, but they do sort of give themselves little edges. So I'm just giving you guys a little bit of insider know-how on this sort of stuff. So that's pretty much all it for my videos on the Euros 2-Deck Championships format. What do you guys think? Do you guys like this format? Do you guys have any feedback on what your strategies for deck selection are and that sort of thing? I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you guys have any feedback, please feel free to put some comments in the comment section below. I do respond to as many of you guys as possible, and I'll catch you guys later. Grand J out.